We have been doing a deep dive into each of the houses in astrology, and we have come across the last house, potentially the most misunderstood house, and also I think my favorite house. So let's get into it. This is the 12th house. The 12th house in astrology is primarily about everything that is hidden from your purview, right? So this can include the hidden parts of you, this can include things that are hidden from you by other people, and this can also include things that are largely considered to be hidden by society. Hidden, pushed to the outskirts, marginalized. These are all concepts that we can include with the 12th house. As for the hidden parts of you, the 12th house is speaking to your subconscious, dreams, intuition in some ways, meditation, anything that you do to cultivate and foster a relationship with your internal self and a part of you that is not as visible either to you or to others in some ways, but the others part is complicated. This can include things like the concept of collective unconsciousness. It can include actually a term that is often used for the 12th house is the house of self-undoing, right? And we can consider this in both a negative tilt and a positive tilt, right? The house of undoing yourself, of taking yourself apart, the house of looking at you, of contending with pieces that aren't necessarily as visible or obvious, but it's also the house of unraveling yourself in a more negative context and isolating yourself. It can be the house of things that take you apart, the house of escapism in some ways. So it's important to watch that balance. This is a house that is representative of suffering in some ways. And so this can mean your own internal suffering or the relationships that you have with other people who are suffering, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you will be suffering, but it might mean that a lot of your work in the world is revolved around maybe helping other people to deal with theirs. It can deal with the concept of isolation. Same rules apply, right? Other people's isolation or yours. Probably both often. But the internal self, hidden enemies fall into this category. People on the outskirts of society, people who are marginalized, people who are largely unseen by society or deemed to some extent or other unworthy of being seen. This can be a challenging house in a lot of ways, but it's also, I would argue, challenging because of how much our society chooses not to look at, right? I think a big part of that is contextual, and we live in a society where we like to hide things, we like to marginalize things, we like to decide we're not going to look at things that are challenging, and so the 12th house can get very loaded in that context. But if you're comfortable looking at it and reflecting on it, it can become a lot less weighty. So the 12th house also encompasses institutions. So this can mean hospitals, this can mean meditation centers, this can mean prisons. And the concept is that we are being pushed away from society, kept away from society, or locked away from society, right? So that's why they all fall into the 12th house. But these can be places that you go to for healing. They can be places you go to for spirituality. They could be places that you go to for punishment. It's about the fact that you're going somewhere else. Or being held somewhere else. The 12th house is also the house of labor, the house of labor before you're born as well, right? So the person who gave birth to you, this is the house that's going to speak to the conditions of what it was like to give birth to you in some ways, because this is speaking to the 2.5 hours or so before you were born in your birth chart. So conceptually, it's how do we bring things to fruition? What do we bring to fruition? What is the hidden work that makes it possible for something to be visible at some point? How do we make something happen? How do we bridge that gap between what exists and what doesn't exist into what does exist? What we can't see into what we can see, right? Because the 12th house is moving us into the first house in that way. The 12th house is the joy of Saturn sitting in opposition to the 6th house, the joy of Mars. In opposition to the 6th house, it is rounding out that axis of how does my internal mental state materialize? 6th house. How does my material life internalize? 12th house. It's a cadent house, so in some ways we are still expanding on those concepts that we brought up in the 10th house, right? We're still talking about something that's very big picture, that's very out in the world in some ways, or that's very not you in some ways, but we're also moving into what is just so intimately you, into the next angular house, which is the first house. This is a dark house or an unaspected house. So it is in a whole sign semi-sextile relationship to the first house, which basically just means they can't see each other. So placements here might feel a little bit harder to access or understand. These might be things that other people can see in you a little bit more easily than you're able to see them in yourself. But also these can be the things that are hidden without being... They're hidden, but it doesn't mean they're impossible to get to, if that makes sense, right? They're just not easy to get to. So that's how I would think about placements in the 12th house or transits that are triggering the 12th house. It can be hard to have transits to your 12th house, especially if you're not used to that energy natally. It can feel out of control, like it's kind of coming out of the woodwork in these hidden sorts of ways, or that it can trigger feelings of isolation. You can look to the ruler of your 12th house for more information about how to access this house, get to know it, especially when it comes to dark or unaspected houses. If the ruler is sitting in a house that is not a dark or unaspected houses, 2, 8, 6, and 12, this might be a good way for you to figure out how to get into these harder to get to spaces. But the conditions of the ruler, the sign that it's in, aspects to it, the house that it's in will speak to the motivations and drive behind this house in some ways. If you have any questions, please let me know. And up next, we have no houses because we have finished it. So yeah, thanks for doing this with me. And let me know if there's anything else we should do this with.